Hi again then guys, and welcome to another individual car review, of course for one of the 5 cars from the 1.34 selection, and as I've alluded to before, this is easily my favourite car of the 5, but interestingly for me, it's my favourite of the 5 in the real world, but not necessarily in terms of debuting in the game, or in this case returning to the game, because I would say that the McLaren is probably the standout from this pack. It's just so good in every way, whereas the SLR, it's never really been a class leader. In Gran Turismo 6, for instance, it was never quite as quick as a lot of the other supercars around Route X, for instance, and now it's even worse because the top speed is a lot slower than it even used to be in comparison to many of its rivals. It used to be on par with stuff like the Viper ACR, the Viper SRT10, the Corvette C6 Z06, close to the ZR1. It's not that quick anymore. You struggle to pass 257 with it on its own, and that's fully tuned. And one of the reasons why is because of the power limitations. Some of the other cars like the Skyline, the Supra, a number of others, the Enzo, the Ford GT, they're very similar now in terms of power to what they already were in GT6. This one though has suffered a lot. Peak power is around 780 horsepower fully tuned, compared to about 1006 in Gran Turismo 6, and that was for the premium one. The non-premium SLR still had around 990, so it's dropped by a huge amount. That's unfortunate, especially for those of us who would love to use this car on Route X or Le Mans or tracks like that for supercars that require a lot of top-end speed. It's not so much of an option now, but that puts the car in an interesting scenario where you kind of have to rely on everything else to see if it can still be good and still be useful. Now, of course, earlier on this week I did a tune setup for the SLR in N500, so significantly reduced power but also reduced weight, to see could the car's raw ability still cut it against cars which are, for instance, tuned up to N500 instead of down, despite the fact that it's older, bigger and heavier. Yes, it can still perform, it's still competitive, and for a car which is not a hardcore track day supercar, this is no Gumper Apollo, it's no Ascari A10, this is much more on the level of something like a Ferrari FF, or a Bentley Continental GT, or even a Lister Storm, which was a bigger, heavier 2+2 seater luxury supercar. The SLR is in that exact same category. Now, on a very slight but still relevant tangent, an interesting comment arose a few days ago by a subscriber on the channel, which I replied to, and I think it's an interesting point to make, and that is the SLR an unsung hero now? Because people don't really talk about it anymore. Now, I would say no, I don't think it is an unsung hero. However, I would say that it falls into a very interesting category between being forgotten and being popular, and that is this sort of no man's land of being recognised as good, for sure, but still kind of underestimated and almost taken for granted to some degree. And I would put in that same category stuff like the original Veyron, which many people have got over by this point, despite the fact that it is still a very impressive car, and even stuff like the original 2007 Nissan GTR, which utterly destroyed everything else in the supersport scene when it arrived, especially in terms of value for money, and yet people just don't give it that kind of respect anymore because of how good everything else is becoming, despite the fact that the R35 did that over a decade ago. That's impressive, and yet people don't give those cars that kind of respect anymore. I think that the SLR does fall into that same category, because although those of us who do love it tend to really, really love it, there are plenty of people who just don't. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just a case of it being a car that still has a lot to offer. The standard SLR, standard being a very relative term, was already a car with more power and more torque than the Zonda C12S or the Porsche Carrera GT at the time. That is no slouch. It has the same engine spec as a Ford GT of the time, a 5.4 litre supercharged V8. It has state-of-the-art tech, carbon fibre body, very awkward to engineer short exhausts which come out of the side. Sounds like a small inconsequential thing, but trust me, that's not an easy thing to engineer. To fit the mufflers, the cat and everything that you have to legally do into something like that, that's not easy. You have to engineer the car well to accomplish that, especially considering that they made 1,000 SLRs. That is a high volume production supercar, and they are still worth hundreds of thousands of pounds even now, which a lot of supercars aren't. They lose their value over time. The Carrera GT and the SLR have both kept their value. In real life, this was a 208 mph car. In the game, the top speed isn't quite as remarkable, as I kind of alluded to, and that leaves us with handling. Can it still compete? Well, yes and no. It's not that it specifically cannot compete in any way, it's just that you cannot fundamentally change the fact that it is this bigger, heavier, more luxurious, long-distance approach to a supercar. The same kind of issue that something like an Aston Martin Vanquish would have, where, comparatively speaking, it is by no means a slow car in any sense, but the automotive world, and especially the exotic world, advances so quickly that cars that are like that tend to easily get left behind. And unfortunately, I think that's kind of happened to the SLR. It's the kind of car where you need to fully experience what makes it so good in the real world, whereas in a game, you just cannot really see why it's so good, because, factually speaking, it's not the quickest thing out there anymore. There are plenty of quicker supercars to choose from, especially when it comes to lap times, rather than just straight line speed. And that's kind of a shame, and to some degree I already knew that that was going to happen, because that's how the SLR always feels in games. Back in the earlier 2000s, for instance in Gran Turismo 4, which was the first game that I saw to feature this car, it felt really good. It was one of the best supercars in the game at that time because its main rivals were the Zonda C12S and the Ford GT. Now it has so much more to go up against, so of course all supercars suffer with the passage of time, but some of them can still hold up in terms of trackability, and some of them, I wouldn't say don't hold up, but they just hold up in ways that you cannot fully appreciate in a game. And I've discussed that before with other cars as well, stuff like the Tesla Model S. It has 7 seats, loads of space, partially recycled interior, great acceleration, great fuel range on the charge. You can't experience half of that stuff in any racing game. Even Test Drive Unlimited, where you can open the windows and look around the car, you still don't need stuff like practicality. So there are certain cars which the best things about them could never be experienced in a game, because it's not just about how fast they are. And for me, that is the exact thing about the SLR. Even when it was released, it wasn't really about being the fastest. 208 wasn't the fastest at the time, let alone now. But that wasn't the point. Mercedes wasn't trying to make the fastest supercar around. They were making, in effect, what Horacio Pagani made with the Zonda. Just a really exquisitely built, well-engineered, really nice all-rounder. And that, the SLR definitely still is. In terms of its trackability though, it's more the kind of car that I would recommend for people who are specifically fans of it, because for 600,000 credits, which is a huge amount in this game, there are most definitely quicker options out there. Of course, even something like a Porsche GT3 can beat this around a track. Plenty of others can as well. The Ford GT gives it a run for its money and can beat it in a straight line. So, for value, no, it's not the best. But you can say that about a lot of the best supercars ever made. Even something like a Zonda, it can be beaten fairly easily by many other supercars in terms of lap time, and certainly in terms of straight line performance, but I would still call it the most perfect supercar ever made, in its F form in particular. So to me, the SLR is a car which I will always love, but I can certainly understand why many players would feel kind of indifferent about it. It really does depend on what kind of player you are. If you're looking for the fastest thing out there with the best bang for buck, give it a pass. If you love the car, then I don't think you'll be disappointed. It feels very good, it feels better now as a track car than it did in the previous game. Unfortunately, it's just not as quick in a straight line. But that's it for my thoughts. Of course, check out the circuit tune that I did if you haven't already, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.